Hello everyone, my name is Steffen Farny. I'm an assistant professor at Leuphana University Lüneburg, and I'm happy to present my research in post-disaster contexts. And this presentation is entitled Affective Ethnographic Inquiry into these different settings. So I'll be focusing on how to enter the field, how to make sense of one's own emotional experiences as an interpretative source and force in trying to understand and generate new knowledge. So I think for most of you who are doing research in extreme settings, emotional experiences, personal emotional experience are sometimes ranging from something very disturbing, sadness or anger, to extreme moments of joy. But in traditional research, this is often hidden, and we are seeing it as maybe as a threat towards an objective interpretation of what we're doing. But I have been more and more coming to an understanding that this is actually a source and a force for generating new knowledge. So letting your own emotional experience guiding your field work, guiding the interpretation is something extremely relevant, as others have pointed out. So over the years, I come to understand my own research more and more as something that Silvia Gerardi had coined affective ethnography, and I'll be talking a bit about that. And finally, the guiding question, the third one for this presentation, is how to then balance proximity and distance in these extreme contexts, where some people will let you in very closely, and you will be able to affect, but also get affected by the setting, and how that is changing the way you are perhaps being able to distance yourself again in later on interpreting the results. So to me, the questions of balancing proximity and distance is central when doing this kind of affective ethnographic inquiry, which to me, to my understanding, is core in extreme environment or extreme context research, such as post-disaster settings. And I'll be building on my research experience from 3 settings here. So the first one is an ethnographic study where I've done 4 punctuated field trips into a community in northern Haiti affected by the earthquake in 2010. The second one is a volcano eruption where I've looked at 2 different local communities right after the event had happened. And the last one is my current research project on post-hurricane recovery in the Caribbean. And what you will note, as I said before, the first question is how to enter the field and when to enter the field. Here, the access had been really different. So in the Haiti ethnography, which was my PhD dissertation work, I had the chance to partner with a local organization through a Finnish NGO. At the time, I had worked and done my research in Finland at Aalto University. So the rationale for going there was basically convenience sampling. Simple as that. How do you get access to such a difficult field? I had never been to Haiti before, but I had an enormous interest in trying to understand how post-disaster recovery works and what is the role of entrepreneurs there. So I went back and forth, and over time developed a good level of trust. These social entrepreneurs, they let me into their homes, so I was able to stay on the subsequent field trips with their families and get a real closer look of their realities and of their understanding of the world. But the first time I entered there was over a year after the earthquake has happened. So I had captured what I will tell about in a minute, the recovery process and the reconstruction process, but not the disaster response process that I had to reconstruct. But the second field trip, or the second setting, is in Chile, and there, right after the outbreak of the Calbuco volcano in 2015, my colleague Pablo Munoz asked me whether I would have time to come over and basically engage in and study the field right after the eruption. So I was there almost 6 weeks after, And I realized that that was a really different setting, because the situation was such that both communities were still facing a situation that they were inside an evacuation zone. So officially they couldn't stay there overnight. But this was basically, I had no access locally, I had no ties. So the way I entered the field there was that I tried to do some cold calling, and the Chilean university gave me some legitimacy when talking to people. I looked at local offices, and here I was especially fortunate in the local tourist information office at the city adjacent to the area, where they were willing to give out a list of all the entrepreneurs operating in the field. So here access came mainly through just going there and trying to get to have the legitimacy of an official university and a research project in the back, but cold calling and simply seeing what works. And then after a few days, I was able to already make some nice contacts with with people who were willing to support me, and that snowballed to further interviews. So it was a rather unstructured process at the beginning, and I was trying to simply capture what had happened. And you will see the two sides are fairly different, the two communities. And the last one is the hurricane recovery after Irma and Maria on several islands. And there I had a strong interest in trying to do a comparative study from the beginning. So I theoretically sampled the islands along some macroeconomic and historical factors, such as are they now independent, or are they still part of a larger country? Are they running mainly based on tourism and financial industry, or are they still largely running based on natural resources, to see how the natural environment affects the recovery process? And I realized, because I was in Chile too early, that entering the field for my purpose makes more sense to do a bit later. So I entered 2.5 months, or I think even 3 months after the hurricane had happened. So the immediate response, you could say, had settled, even though in Dominica it wasn't the case. But I could see again much more of these activity-based, so entrepreneurial activity-based actions and response happening there. And here the same, I had no contacts neither on the islands. So what I did in this case, because here these settings are a bit more established and I could go through the principal city, I would first contact the Chamber of Commerce and hoping that they would help out, which worked nicely. And also looked simply on the website, always for NGOs operating in the field and for government offices handling the situation. So let me briefly share how the situation differs in these different settings. You might say these are all post-disaster settings, so probably you will find some similarities, but actually the nature and the institutional setup and the history of the country will all result in very different experiences. But also the different types of disasters facing. So Haiti, as I said before, I was in the north. The earthquake had not disrupted the setting, but what had happened there is that because the earthquake had happened near the capital city, the surrounding areas in the capital city were largely destroyed, physically destroyed, and these tent cities had been built up. A lot of people left and also went to the north and returned back home. So the situation I would find in the north were a large wave of internally displaced people, about 30% of new citizens living there now, and of course a lot of stories of tragedy of families who had lost people in the earthquake, or friends of the family whom they had known, because in Haiti the majority of population lives in the capital city. And what is interesting to note here is, first of all, to tell a little bit about how disaster recovery and post-disaster settings normally operate. There are at least two, but some organizations and the literature on post-disaster management oftentimes also talks about 3 different phases. And this is important, even though sometimes challenged, but it's mostly important and acted by the operating organizations because the challenges in the different phases are so different. So in the first phase, the response phase, it's about basic needs to provide housing, food, shelter, medical aid, water, these kind of sources. And this is often provided by external organizations, happening a few weeks. Then the recovery phase, which is when I entered. If it runs well, then in a post-disaster setting, the recovery phase should be finalized after a maximum of 6 months, because it's a transitionary phase to develop plans, to do contingency planning, to do needs assessment, and so on, to enter the real reconstruction again. So this is typical for post-disaster settings. But in Haiti, the recovery phase was massively delayed. So I entered there, and it was still about providing basic facilities such as food, health, and shelter. There was the cholera outbreak, and the need of, for instance, clean water and sanitation was enormous. So if it would have been finalized, for instance, I wouldn't have witnessed these tent cities where there were UN officials telling me more than 1.5 million people living in these tent cities at the time that I had been in the capital area and then in the north. This is just a little bit to understand the context. So what makes this such an extreme setting in many ways? And what I wanted to tell, and this is also described in the paper, is that to me, because I was new to the topic, I didn't have any cultural understanding of Haiti prior to starting this research. I had, I would say, the emotions became a driving force. Not at the beginning, but I realized this maybe after field trip number 2, that I could access my emotions to be able to see how I can relate to people's experiences. Because as we have then later explained in the paper, I realized that a lot of these organizations, they were external organizations, non-Haitian organizations. They were in conversations with their staff, delivering support because they pitied people. But what I was starting to develop, and what the Haitian entrepreneurs especially had to develop, was a strong level of empathy and sympathy with locally affected communities. And this is something that became the key source for the work that the Haitian entrepreneurs had done. So they had been using the development of sympathy and collective empathy in order to legitimize and institutionalize their practices. So to develop something that would fill this void, this inability of the local institutional bodies, of the local institutional capacity was so weak to fill in and provide solutions to this extreme setting. So I needed to return to Finland to make sense of these emotional experiences, which were always very intense, especially living with these entrepreneurs, being with the families 24/7, and witnessing, I would say, the daily challenges of simply managing everyday life was something for somebody who would come from the outside an extreme emotional experience. So I went through discomfort with these levels of extreme poverty, but at the same time, this excitement to see that they're actors trying to deliver relief efforts towards a feeling of returning home, that I was greeted by people I had met many times before. So it was a strong emotional journey there. And what had happened here is that I realized in analyzing the data that the entrepreneurs from the beginning on always saw positive effect and positive emotions as part of their activities, while a lot of these actors coming from the outside, and my own experience were the same as well, we experience a lot of these negative effects or negative emotions, negative feelings here. But the positive emotions were key in their post-disaster practices, which was then the model that we developed, and we called it collective emotions in institutional creation. So I would say what I realized due to that 5-year-long research project is that my own emotions are a sense-making device when operating in extreme contexts, but also that if affect sometimes becomes the research object as such, that is something that I really did not look forward to, because I found at the beginning really fuzzy to work with affect and emotions. So for quite some time, I shied away from making this the central research object, but the data was so full with these affective statements that I felt at some point that I couldn't tell what was really happening without acknowledging affect and the role of affect here. And that became then the central concept or even mechanism, and realized that affect here, especially collective emotions, is completely underappreciated in the institutional work literature. So I titled this talk Affective Ethnographic Inquiry because to me, here the ethnography part is also a craft of writing an effective and performative text. So if you read the paper, you will see that I construct these narratives, these realist tales, these stories, as also a means to create effective performative text to connect with you, with the readers, but also to make sense of this and to show how I was not just in the field, but I was there with the people. So to me, ethnography is very powerful as a research methodology in being able to do so. Now let's move on to the second one. Here the setting was really different. It was in Chile, a volcano outbreak, and I had studied two settings. On the one hand, there was a lot of gravel and the houses collapsed, and that was the site that became part of the paper. But on the other side of the volcano is where the volcanic stream of lava went down, as you can see on the picture. So the story that we took up in the paper was the story of Ensenada, the community in the north. But what I wanted to tell here is how interesting it was to see that this same event had unfolded so differently. So in Correntoso in the south, there the Laha had almost destroyed the entire village. It passed by just at the bridge, destroyed the bridge entering, but nobody had physically been injured. The people, on the other hand, they were suffering an emotional trauma, and I had difficulties in entering the field there and getting to talk to people. People didn't want to return to the site. So it was at the time, because I was there so early, as I said, 6 weeks after, it was difficult to capture this. So that unfortunately didn't become, but it was clear that the effect played such a central role here compared to the north in Ensenada, where it was physical destruction, but people, especially entrepreneurs, were then able to rebuild their communities. It was hands-on that they could do something about. So here, my personal affective experience was so different in these two settings, even though it was the same disaster, the volcano outbreak. That is how I realized that we need to look at the personal level experiences here, and that became then the story looking at entrepreneurial preparedness. So here, ethnographic inquiry, again, was a unique means to access people's distinctive realities. I would never have been able to realize how the two communities had responded so differently without an ethnographic study there. Unfortunately, because I was still in a state of an evacuation zone, I couldn't stay overnight in the area, which would have facilitated the field work a lot. And then to finalize this short talk, the third study was in the Caribbean, 2 hurricanes, Irma and Maria, and this is my current project. And they had been bypassing several islands, destroyed some of them enormously. And my interest was in then to try to understand how the very same physical experience can lead to different responses. And in the end, I centered a lot on Dominica, which is an island in the Southern Caribbean, not oftentimes experiencing these extreme hurricanes, but this time physical destruction was enormous. I was there 3 months after, simply flying over and trying to find a way to access the field while being there. And I realized that a lot of people are extremely willing because so few organizations had been there. And that was really different to the other two settings where external aid had been really successful in the very first weeks. A lot of attention has been paid on these disasters, but here they were left alone. And then I was able to, I would say, again, enter their lives, stay with some of these affected communities. So it was a journey from being there to being with, how Silvia Gerardi calls it. And here the ethnographic part allowed me to study the human-nature relationships because of the comparative setting. To wrap this up, I come to understand that a lot of extreme context research can very well be studied through what Silvia Gerardi calls affective ethnography, and something that I had practiced without knowing that the term exists pretty much for all my researcher life. So it's a style of performative ethnographic process that relies on one's capacity to affect and be affected. In Haiti, I was part of on some project, so physically getting my hands dirty, building something. And it's this experience that then allowed me to understand that there's something that we labeled collective emotions that drives the entire reconstruction process. So it's the ability of the researcher to allow oneself to affect and be affected. And I hope this will be a good, fruitful talk for discussion. I'm really looking forward to the seminar.